Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. More war for the new year. Netenyahu and the Epstein files forces Trump to attack Iran. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, Trump is making a terrible mistake as usual. Let's get into the content. Salute.
All right, guys, Trump is warning Iran now that the U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to go, and he's now vowing to rescue protesters if Iran shoots and kills any of these people in the streets. So there's a lot of mounting social unrest in the streets. Some are saying that it looks like a color revolution is starting to spring up. Some are pointing the finger at the West.
That's the CIA.
On having people on the ground trying to kick this up and spark this. And of course, Iran is saying that they're in all-out war with the West, with us in Israel. This is like the pretext to striking them again. Trump warning that he hears whatsoever that any protesters have been shot. He's sending in the cavalry, so to speak. This is Iran, the last big bad boogeyman, so to speak, that they have on the list in the area, especially when it comes to Israel. And it's not over. We kind of seen this coming before when they struck these facilities, these underground nuclear sites, so to speak, and they immediately said they destroyed them. And then we seen satellite imagery and evidence that they weren't destroyed. Then they later came out and admitted, okay, maybe they weren't. After saying, oh no, they're destroyed. They're always back and forth, and it's whatever they say goes in their mind, whether it's the truth or not. Does Iran have some capabilities somewhere else? I'm sure they do. At this point, it looks like they're going to make a move, and this is one of the excuses to do so. Things could really pop off big time. Remember, Israel and Iran were exchanging missile strikes. Iran couldn't stop all of Israel's. Israel in its Iron Dome could not stop the hypersonic missiles coming from Iran. Remember that. Join me for the live show, going live tonight, every Monday.
About crowds and tear gas, you and me have to name the engine that keeps producing these shocks in Iran. It's the sanctions architecture and financial warfare, years of choking oil revenue, poisoning banking channels, and turning ordinary trade into a minefield. That is what makes a currency vulnerable to panic. And once a currency starts sliding under siege conditions, it doesn't just hurt spreadsheets, it hurts bread, rent, transport, medicine, and the ability to plan tomorrow. So when the West frames this as Iran failing, understand the cruelty of the playbook. Sanctions create the wound, then propaganda points to the bleeding as proof the patient deserves more pressure. See some of the footages they are circulating online as the protest. And that's why this latest protest wave matters so much, because it's not abstract politics, it's sanctions pressure translating into street reality. Iran's currency shock finally spilled out of the exchange market and into the street. The rial hit a fresh record low on the open market, and protests erupted, led by shopkeepers and traders in Tehran, with reports of similar demonstrations in other major cities like Isfahan, Shiraz and Mashhad. And in parts of Tehran, police used tear gas to disperse crowds. And the trigger was that stomach drop moment when prices move so fast that business becomes impossible and people feel like their wages are being melted in real time. Like and share to help me out. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, here's where the information war kicks in, because the minute economic pain becomes visible, the outside ecosystem moves to capture it. Foreign language broadcasters, diaspora networks, coordinated social posting. They turn a localized market shock into a global spectacle within hours, selecting the most emotional clips, stripping sanctions context, and pushing one storyline. The state is collapsing. And if you've watched regime change politics long enough, you already know what comes next. The same capitals that engineered the economic suffocation then use the unrest as marketing for tighter measures, packaged as support for the people, even though the tightening is what crushes the people. You can hear President Donald Trump already signaling exploiting the moment to strike Iran. This is during war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu's meeting. And yes, we have to address Israel responsibly. Israel has a long history of covert action, sabotage, cyber capabilities, and psychological operations aimed at Iran, and it has obvious motive to exploit instability. That part is basic statecraft. The disciplined question is whether there is verified evidence that Israel is organizing these protests on the ground. And the honest answer right now is that the strongest public evidence points to opportunistic exploitation and amplification rather than proven direct orchestration. There are claims online about Israeli-linked messaging and disinformation activity. But here's the key point you and me cannot miss. Foreign exploitation does not require foreign authorship. Even fully organic protests can be weaponized by external enemies through a predictable playbook. Narrative capture first, delegitimize the state, erase sanctions from the story, stimulate economic panic, push calls for international action, justify sanctions escalation, and increase covert pressure under cover of distraction. So when you see this wave, you can hold two truths at once without contradiction. The grievances are real and domestic, and the enemies of Iran can still try to turn those grievances into a tool against Iran. And Iran's response came fast, because when the bazaar moves, the whole country feels it. The central bank governor, Mohammad Reza Farzin, was reported to have resigned pending presidential approval, and state-linked messaging signaled a leadership shift at the top of the monetary apparatus, with Abdel Nasser Hemati widely reported as the likely replacement. So look at the rhythm here. Currency plunges, traders shut down, streets fill. Then the system tries to stabilize confidence by swapping the face in charge of the currency, because whether you like it or not, currencies are partly psychology. And when the psychology breaks, you get street politics. This is where the economic backdrop becomes the spine of the story. Inflation is not a headline, it's a daily tax on breathing. And when inflation is high and the currency is sliding, people rush into safer stores of value, dollars, gold, goods, anything. And that demand pushes the rial down further, which then feeds more inflation. And you get that vicious spiral where the market starts setting the political mood, and that mood is exactly what sanctions warfare is designed to inflame, not because it targets leaders, but because it targets the stability of ordinary life until unrest becomes inevitable. And yes, we can acknowledge secondary factors without letting the West off the hook. Domestic issues exist, corruption perceptions exist, policy mistakes happen, factional battles and inconsistent messaging can worsen things. But under sanction siege, the normal tools of stabilization are crippled, investment channels are strangled, access to spare parts and machinery becomes harder. Even medicine imports can get tangled in banking restrictions despite exemptions on paper, and the cost of doing basic transactions rises. So even competent governance becomes firefighting with one hand tied behind your back. And that's why I call sanctions what they are: collective punishment and economic siege tactics designed to generate internal unrest. Because if your aim is behavior change, you target the population's living conditions until pressure rises internally. That is the strategy. Now let's talk about who is behind it, because this is where propaganda gets weaponized from both sides, and we have to separate organic actors from organized opposition and from amplification ecosystems. The organic actors in the most recent wave, based on what is verified, are primarily traders, shopkeepers, and market networks. People whose livelihoods depend on predictable prices and supply, and their immediate grievance is the currency plunge and the cost of living. They are not waiting for foreign instruction to feel the shock. They feel it at the counter and in the warehouse. And when those networks close shops and encourage others to close, you get a visible, contagious form of protest that doesn't require a formal national leadership structure. Then you have organized opposition currents, especially outside Iran, that try to convert any economic protest into a broader political campaign. You see attempts in calls for strikes, unity messaging, and packaging events into a single national uprising narrative. But here is the disciplined point. The existence of those calls does not automatically mean they are controlling events on the ground. Very often they are riding the wave and trying to claim authorship after the fact. And that's why you don't treat diaspora messaging as proof of command and control inside Iran unless credible reporting establishes direct coordination, funding, or operational links. Now, the outlook, and I'm going to give it to you straight, in the next 2 to 4 weeks, the biggest variable is whether the government can restore even partial currency confidence, because if traders believe the ryle will keep sliding, you'll see more shop closures, more localized gatherings, and more scattered confrontations. The leadership shift at the central bank is meant to signal urgency, but it doesn't magically remove sanctions, it doesn't magically open banking channels, and it doesn't reverse the deep structural constraints. So the state will likely try a mix of measures: enforcement against black market activity, tighter messaging, temporary stabilization efforts, and political signaling about listening to legitimate demands, while keeping security forces ready to prevent gatherings from expanding into broader political unrest. In the 4 to 12-week window, escalation risk depends on whether this stays a bazaar-led economic wave or expands into a multi-sector movement, and the triggers for expansion are predictable: further currency drops, fuel or subsidy shocks, any policy move that hits daily life hard, and any security crackdown that produces widely verified casualties or mass arrests. Because those are the moments that transform a price protest into a dignity protest. And once that conversion happens, the momentum becomes harder to manage. And that's exactly the kind of inflection point Iran's enemies will try to exploit with maximum media pressure and maximum sanctions messaging. And I want to end with the moral clarity that Western capitals hate. Sanctions are not a humane alternative to war. They are economic war, a siege designed to force political outcomes by grinding a society. And then when the society reacts, that reaction is used as propaganda to justify grinding it harder. If you actually care about ordinary Iranians, you don't tighten the screws on their banking system and call it freedom. You stop the collective punishment and let normal economic life breathe, because stability doesn't grow out of strangulation. Now, I want you to tell me what you think in the comments. Do you think this is organic unrest being exploited or foreign engineered from the start, and why? And what would convince you one way or the other? Or thank you for watching. Subscribe to support honest journalism.
November 30th, 2025. And Trump is once again threatening to bomb Iran as he stood next to Netanyahu outside of Mar-a-Lago and declared that the U.S. was ready for the next phase of war and that Iran should know the consequences. But what would that actually look like, as Iran has spent the last 6 months preparing for the next phase of war, preparing for a possible attack, and making it clear that every time they retaliate, that the price that Israel is forced to pay will be increased each time. All of this comes as the Iranian president is saying publicly that his country is at war with the West because the US and Israel and Europe, they do not want Iran to be a stable country. If they did, they wouldn't be targeting it with all of these economic sanctions and trying to make it sound as if Iran is on the verge of collapse at any moment, while also insisting that it is the world's greatest threat. So, what should we be keeping an eye on as we go into the new year? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Syed Mohammed Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope you and your audience have a very good year ahead of you. And I hope you've enjoyed your Christmas too.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you on the show. And yeah, I cannot believe it's almost 2026 here, but it seems as though we couldn't get through the year, couldn't get through 2025 without Netanyahu making one last visit to Trump. This time he went to Mar-a-Lago, of all places, to meet in person with Trump on Monday. And Trump went from gushing over Netanyahu, he then turns around and he's like, oh, yeah, we haven't forgotten about war with Iran threatening to bomb the country again. And I thought it was interesting that the Washington Post did report that support for additional strikes against Iran was on Netanyahu's wish list for this visit. But they are, of course, also still dealing with the genocide in Gaza. So they have to figure that out as well. So, how do you see this visit, and should we be concerned when Trump and Netanyahu are getting together in person again?
Well, Trump, Netanyahu, and Biden are the three main ringleaders for the Gaza genocide. So it's always concerning when the three of them talk about anything. I think that Trump, of course, he is constantly flip-flopping, and his position changes very rapidly on different issues. The Ukrainian issue is just one such example, but there are many. So I don't think anyone in Iran really, anyone of importance in the state, decision makers. I don't think any of them take anything that he says seriously, whether it's Trump or Netanyahu, about waging war or about not waging war. The government and the state, they are, and the armed forces, they are preparing the country for war. And as they say, the best way to prevent war is to be prepared for war. I think it's pretty clear that 6 months after the war, the Iranian armed forces today and the administration, the government, they're much more prepared for war than they were back then. And if the Israeli regime or Trump, they decide to launch another war, I think it will be much worse for them than last time around. But in any case, Netanyahu is a person who needs war and crisis and crises to stay in power. And if he is removed from power, he'll probably or possibly go to jail, because now that even the judiciary is being weakened. So, but he's still in trouble. His wife is also in trouble, and she's a powerful figure as well. So we should always expect trouble or death and destruction and slaughter as long as Netanyahu is in power. And he is doing that, by the way. Every day he's murdering people in Gaza, and the same is true in Lebanon. ever since October the 7th in the West Bank, there have been well over 1,000 deaths, murders. And in Gaza, since the so-called ceasefire, we've had well over 400 murders. And in Lebanon, they're assassinating people on a daily basis, civilians. They don't care, and neither does the Western media. Just 2-3 months ago, a family in southern Lebanon was murdered. 3 kids, all of them American Lebanese. Their father was murdered, American Lebanese, but the U.S. Embassy, Western media, the State Department, the U.S. government, none of them. They were completely indifferent. So, as long as Netanyahu's there, you can expect people to die.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. And you're right. When I see Trump and Netanyahu together, I mean, they could come out and say that they want world peace, but we have seen absolutely no indication that they are going to give us anything other than more and more genocide and more war. And I thought it was interesting. You've got Trump's threats that, of course, he talks. He's always talking. Well, then we saw that the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian published a post on X that said, quote, "The response of the Islamic Republic of Iran to any oppressive aggression will be harsh and regrettable." Now, that's according to Google's translation. But Iran has been warning the US and Israel for months that its retaliation is going to increase each time it is attacked. So, how do you see these kind of building tensions here? And as you were noting earlier, Iran is more and more prepared, but do you think that the US and Israel fully realize what they would be getting into if they were to carry out another attack?
No, I don't think they calculate correctly. They miscalculated the first war. They thought that they will be able to undermine the state and carry out what they like to call regime change. But after, I don't know the exact time, but after 5 to 6 days, the Netanyahu regime was asking Trump to get a ceasefire. And Steve Bannon uh, was the first after the ceasefire who I recall came out and said that the hidden story of all this was that Israel was in very bad shape, and that Trump basically saved them by getting this ceasefire deal after 12 days. So today, if it's restarted, the Iranians are far more prepared than they were last time round, and it will be much more difficult to surprise the Iranians the way they did. But I don't think they see it that way. The Israelis, they are supremacists, and so people who are supremacists, they always underestimate everyone else. And the United States government is also exceptionalist, and in a way, it's sort of like a supremacist, the same sort of supremacist worldview. They see themselves as exceptional, and therefore they always look down at everyone else. That's why China is always collapsing, Russia is losing the war, Iran is always on the verge of collapse, because they cannot really digest the notion that these states are legitimate, that they're powerful, that they are competent, and they're capable of defending themselves. So I don't think that they read the situation accurately. But also, from my understanding, from what former intelligence officers have said, some of them are, I think, have been on your show. Intelligence in the United States today has been much more politicized than it was in decades past, in many decades past, like 50, 60 years ago, 40 years ago. And that, of course, makes it all the more problematic. But what is the good thing is that people across the world are waking up to the empire. People across the world dislike Netanyahu, and Americans, who are the most propagandized people in the world, they too are waking up. The anti-genocide protests over the last 2 years, they were led in many instances by young university students, many of them Jews. So people from all walks of life, from all religions, from different ethnic groups and races, even in the United States, where the media machine is very powerful, they are waking up. So that, I think, is probably the most um, important element in all this, that despite all the horrors that we've seen over the last 2 years and 3 months, there has been an awakening across the globe, but most importantly in the United States, which is the main backer of the Israeli regime, that will make it much more difficult in future for the regime to behave in the way it does among the left, among the liberals, among independents, and now increasingly among the right. We see major figures in the right breaking away from MAGA, um, and you hear the division between the American Firsters and the MAGA. Now that this has very much to do with Netanyahu and Zionism and the Israeli regime.
Yeah, and you can see that Netanyahu is starting to get desperate, right? He's like clinging to Trump, knowing that, okay, I've only got a few more years left of at least this version of the US administration that seems to be all gung ho for whatever it is that Israel wants. And I thought it was interesting because Trump released his national security strategy for his second term. And it seemed as though they had almost kind of forgotten about the Middle East, right? The focus was on bringing back the Monroe Doctrine, conquering the Western Hemisphere. It seemed as though we were all set for war on Venezuela. And so I'm curious too, when you look at the timing of Netanyahu's visit, does it seem like the goal there was to kind of bring Trump's focus back to the situation, be it the genocide in Gaza and this push to quote unquote disarm Hamas or a future war with Iran? Does it seem like that was the push, or is this all just a show at the end of the day and we shouldn't really take this document too seriously?
Well, when it first came out, I was interviewed by a couple of people, and this question was they asked me about this, and I said I don't believe this document is ever going to be implemented, and that the United States, as long as this regime exists and this current political regime in the United States is in power, they will continue to support it. And so I don't really, I don't think that the document, I don't take it as seriously as some people do. But what I do think is important is that the Israeli regime, not only has it become immensely unpopular and it's delegitimized itself in the eyes of the world, but it has failed in the war against Iran. It has not succeeded in Lebanon. It never defeated Hezbollah. It never gained any foothold in Lebanon. It only gained some territory after the ceasefire, in violation of the ceasefire, because of the incompetence of the Lebanese government. They failed in Yemen, and they haven't been able to take Gaza. And the Gazans are rebuilding their defenses, no doubt. And of course, Iran would definitely be supporting them. So the Israelis, the only place where they had some success was in Syria. And of course, Trump thanked Erdogan yesterday for that. He said that he helped us get rid of the previous government, and he said Netanyahu agrees with me on that. In other words, it's Netanyahu and Trump is basically admitting that Netanyahu, Trump, and Erdogan, and of course Biden, they were all on the same page when it came to Syria, which I think is a fascinating admission. But beyond all that, the Israeli regime has overextended itself. We've just heard that the United Arab Emirates is pulling out its armed forces from southern Yemen. We see a big divide growing between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is the UAE is probably the closest ally of the Israeli regime in our region. Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, all of them cooperate with the regime, but the relationship with the UAE is something special. And the Saudis have this divide is not good news for the Israeli regime, whether it's in Yemen or in Somalia or in Sudan. It's not good for them. And also the shameless alliance that the Israelis are creating with Cyprus and Greece. I mean, regardless of the relationship, who's right and who's wrong, but in the relationship between Greece and Turkey, that's one issue. But to align yourself with a genocidal regime against Turkey is, I think, going way too far. But this is pushing Turkey, which now feels vulnerable because it didn't get what it sought to gain in Syria. Now it's feeling pressure from the Israeli regime and its allies. It's tilting towards Iran, and the Turkish president is going to visit Tehran shortly. So the regime has gone too far, I think, and it has overextended itself. It has lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the world. It, as I said, it had a few tactical victories, but I think strategically this has been a major failure for the regime. All of this, the whole 2 years and 3 months.
Yeah, I'm with you. You look at their actual long-term gains, and exactly as you were saying, it's really about the long-term awakening. And I thought it was interesting too, one other note that we heard from the Iranian president, he described the current state of tensions on Saturday by saying, quote, "We are in a full-scale war with the US, Israel, and Europe. They don't want our country to remain stable." He also said that the West war against Iran is more complicated and more difficult than the Iran Iraq war of the 1980s. Now, Iran is not just being hit with direct attacks, but also with economic sanctions. You've got reports here in the West that are really highlighting recent protest over surging inflation and currency concerns. So, how do you view the current state of the West war against Iran, where they may not necessarily be bombing right now, but they're still doing everything that they possibly can with the ongoing sanctions targeting the Iranian people?
Yes, the sanctions are basically there to hurt ordinary people, to kill people, to destroy their lives. It has nothing to do with governments, whether it's Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. It doesn't make a difference. The target is ordinary people. It's intended to make people make them desperate, to make them fall to their knees, and then out of desperation undermine their governments and do the bidding of the West, and so that the West can get what it wants. Or in the case of Venezuela, Trump was very blunt about it. We take back our oil and our land and all that. Anything that, I mean, very blunt, very brief. This is how I would put it. Anything that you see in the Western media, it doesn't matter if it comes from the liberals or the conservatives. Mainstream Western media is never honest about Iran. I do not ever recall reading a single article from beginning to end where I said, wow, this is like a good article. It is always full of disinformation and misinformation and twisted truths. And so people, and that creates a false understanding in the West, even among Western elites. They think Iran is always collapsing. Well, that's what they've been saying about Russia too for 4 years. That's what they've been saying about the Chinese economy for decades. That's what they've been saying about Iran for decades. No, Iran is not going to collapse. Iran is not going to be undermined or overthrown. And they can't come to terms with this reality. So if there are demonstrations in Iran, or if there are riots in Iran, or if there's unrest somewhere in Iran, in a country of 91 million, doesn't mean anything is going to happen. When General Soleimani, where it's his anniversary around now, when he was murdered by the Americans, we saw millions of people come to the streets for his funeral. So are these people the ones who are going to overthrow the state? The problem in the United States is that they make this propaganda and they believe their own propaganda. And so even President Pezeshkian's statement, when he made that statement, it was twisted in the West. They said that he was declaring war on the West, whereas he was just stating a fact, saying that the collective West is out to undermine Iran. But they make it as if he's the one who's declaring war on the West. That's the situation that we live in. But the good news is that, especially after Gaza, people are waking up to the reality. Mainstream media is discredited. I mean, when I'm on your show, and I compare it to when I'm on mainstream Western media, your audience is larger than on ordinary occasions, when maybe if some conflict between me and the host takes place and it becomes, there's sparks or something like that, I may get there may be a larger audience, but your audience is very large. And the same is true with some of your friends and colleagues, people that you and I both know and like. And the Western media doesn't have the sort of influence that it had 5 years ago. And you see that playing out in U.S. politics itself, whether it's Candace Owens now, who's whose viewership has gone through the roof, or Tucker Carlson, or even Steve Bannon, and these people with their differing views, they now have more influence than the mainstream media outlet. So I'm not as worried, or I'm not as, I shouldn't say worried, but I'm not as concerned, or I don't care as much about the influence of Western media now than a few years ago. Of
Yes.
course, censorship is on the rise, social media is clamping down. I get all that, but still, I think that they've lost control, the powers that be.
Yeah, you can only promote endless war and genocide for so long. And exactly as you were also noting, one day they'll come out and they'll say, oh, Iran is on the verge of collapse. The government is going to fall. And then the next day, Iran is the greatest threat to the world that we've
Oh
ever heard
yes,
of.
no,
So,
fantastic example. I mean, how do they combine these two things at the same time is beyond me. Beyond me. How can a regime, as they like to call it, that's on the verge of collapse, deeply despised, incompetent, corrupt, hated universally, how can it be a growing threat and menace to not just the region but to the entire world at the same time?
yeah, that is the $64 million question that they definitely don't want the public to ask. But I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing to continue to challenge the mainstream media and really the Western narrative, both on the mainstream media and over here in the alternative media. Syed Mohammed Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and
He didn't open it, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Either Trump is getting the mushroom treatment, and by that I mean he's being kept in the dark and deliberately fed a bunch of manure. He's given orders and they're being ignored, or he's playing a duplicitous game where he knows exactly what's going on. He's given the CIA the green light to continue carrying out attacks, even though the military has withdrawn. U.S. military support has diminished, but that Trump has told the CIA, yeah, go ahead and kick the hell out of the Russians. Or a third possibility is um, he's it's deliberate, plausible deniability. So he has not issued orders to stop, but he hasn't. He's keeping a distance so that he can claim, oh, yeah, I didn't know about this. What is clear is that the CIA is conducting operations that are acts of war against Russia. And I think that is one of the reasons you saw the furious reaction across the board in Russia to that failed attack when they launched 91 drones to assassinate Putin. And because before, until 2 days ago, I was not in a position to argue, well, was it really a CIA operation, or was this just the Brits running rogue? No, CIA operation all the way. Why? Because they delivered to the president. It wasn't. Uh, it wasn't an attempt to kill Putin. The target was a military installation near Putin's residence. What the hell? How do they know that? The only way you know that is if you're involved in planning the operation. Number one. Number two, they're terrible liars because the Russians have recovered one of the electronic components that contains the flight path and the targeting information. The Russians exploited it, and they've now turned it over to the United States, to the defense attaché in Moscow. They called him to defense, the Ministry of Defense, and welcomed him and basically said, we've gone this, we've examined it, we've been able to extract the data, and this is what it shows. And here's you can have it back. So the CIA, for a variety of reasons, some of them financial, some of them that they're heavily invested just from a professional standpoint within, let's not discount what I call the bureaucratic inertia that drives a lot of these. But Trump's playing a dangerous, dangerous game. And Russia now, I think, based upon what they've said, going to escalate this in a very dramatic fashion, and probably will include targeting and killing British and U.S. intelligence operatives.
Yeah. Carl, in your opinion, CIA, in the way that they're behaving, somehow is doing it, as Larry was somehow mentioning, suggesting, without informing the President of the United States, or maybe Tulsi Gabbard?
I think Larry's right in the several scenarios he painted. There are permutations of each one of those scenarios. And I will remind you that in 2016, well, whatever year it was in his first term, right at the end, I guess, so it must have been about 2020, Trump ordered all U.S. forces out of Syria and they didn't go. Clearly, there are people within the first administration, and I dare say plenty of them in the second administration, who have different agendas than the president does. That's one indicator. Another one is what we were talking about before we went on the air. I think Trump is losing it. I really do. I don't think he can concentrate for very long. I don't think he can listen to his staff and his cabinet for very long. I don't think he has a span of attention physically that goes far enough for him to grasp details. Now, lots of rats will play in that vacuum. And as Larry suggested, and as I've seen up close and personal with regard to the CIA, they are one of the biggest rats in terms of playing with the president's prerogatives. Presidential finding lingers on the National Security Council staff with only 2 or 3 people to oversee it. Those 2 or 3 people are predisposed to the action suggested by the presidential finding. President's out of it now, either because, as Larry said, he wants plausible deniability, or because he really can deny it, he doesn't know what's going on. It's still going on with the CIA, and the CIA is doing it. And what's been revealed, as Larry was talking about, in the 24 to 36 hours or so that have happened, that Russians have had a chance to look at it and so forth, indicates to me that you do have people in the CIA who are still conducting operations, and probably not to the president's knowledge, because this flies in the face, again, as Larry suggested, of his diplomacy. And you can say that the diplomacy is being reinforced and he's been given a higher ground by what he's doing. That's nonsense. There's no way this kind of action, particularly with Putin, is going to get him any leverage or any pressure. What it's going to do is exactly what Larry suggested. Putin's going to strike back. And when he strikes back, it's going to be with a vengeance. So this is not a good development. It's not a good development in any way, not even to mention the aspect of assassinating leaders. This is a dangerous thing to start doing, because of all the leaders in the world that are vulnerable to assassination, we register the one most vulnerable. So this is crazy to start this kind of routine. This is Bibi Netanyahu stuff. This is stupid.
Larry, what do they want to achieve by, let's assume, assassinating Vladimir Putin? What is the outcome after all?
Yeah, this is what is so crazy. But it's not unique to Putin and Russia in this current situation. The U.S., I guess the U.S. foreign policy and defense establishment have operated under what I call the myth of the key man, which has been rampant since the end of World War II. And the notion is this: we take out this one guy, we kill this one person, we get rid of this one individual, and everything will be okay. So, let's get rid of Diem in Vietnam. That'll set the situation right. Well, that didn't happen. We got rid of Manuel Noriega. We got rid of Muammar Gaddafi. We got, uh, we got rid of Saddam Hussein. Boy, that was going to fix the situation. Um, hey, all we got to do is kill Bin Laden, and that's going to stop the terrorism. And so what it reflects is a very um, almost juvenile mentality with respect to uh, you know taking out a key leader. But then the other dimension of this with Russia is Vladimir Putin is criticized in Russia for being seen as weak, as too accommodating of the West, as too patient. So if we get rid of Putin, the next question that is should be asked is what's next? Who's next? And this is the thing that I know from I don't know it firsthand, but I do know it from secondhand testimony from close friends who were firsthand observers. And but I don't care whether we're talking about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the 2001 deployment of troops to Afghanistan, uh, the special military operation with Russia and Ukraine. The the United States, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, they do not plan and think this through in detail. Rather, it's like, oh, it'll work out, it'll be okay. And so, without being able to answer the question, what comes next, you get rid of Putin. Most likely, what comes next is someone like Dmitry Medvedev. And all of a sudden, uh, he is a lawyer, but he doesn't think with the same restraint and calmness that Putin does. He's a much more passionate guy. And this could very, very well lead. I mean, if there was, if Putin was assassinated, there would be tactical nukes launched at the United States. It'd be that simple.
And Nima, I just said what Larry just said is quintessentially the case with Venezuela right now.
Yeah,
The CIA has no idea where they're going from here, nor do we, apparently, other than to disaster.
absolutely.
Coral, I think the question is not only who's going to replace Vladimir Putin if that happens, what would be the reaction on the part of Russians? Yesterday, I talked with Andrei Martyanov. I wanted to know what is the mindset on the part of Russians. What would be the reaction if that happens? He literally said they're going to nuke London.
You
So,
know me?
so what's that? What's that? Why do they're so desperate to escalate? That's why I think that's why they hate Vladimir Putin, because the Russian president is the only reason that this war is not escalating. It's just continuing the way it was before. And they want to remove him from power because they're desperate for escalation in Ukraine.
If you're asking me, there's a body of, shall we say, wise men, I wouldn't call them that, beneath this administration, in the shadows of this administration, neoconservatives, globalists, other people have different titles for them, who think exactly what you just said, that Putin is weak, that he is vulnerable, and that the whole system that he's atop of is equally vulnerable and weak, and that if you take him out, it will all topple. As Larry said, this is almost the model the United States uses to judge other countries by. One individual, whether it's a Gaddafi or a Hussein or whatever, that's the key to the whole thing. These people believe that with regard to Putin. They have not backed off their largely false appreciation of Russia's status. And Putin goes right along with that. Take him down and you take the empire down. You take Russia down.
Yeah.
That's bull, as Larry's pointed out. It's absolute bull. I remember the discussions that we had about Al Qaeda and bin Laden. And we had a couple of smart people in the room with us when we were having these discussions. And they said, essentially, be careful what you wish for, because at that time, the second in Al Qaeda was a pretty competent Egyptian doctor who was pretty ruthless and smart, much more so than bin Laden in terms of the things Al Qaeda was trying to do. You're going to get him. And who do you know is beneath him to take over if you kill him? The same thing was said about the Lion of Panjshir, Masood. You know, you take him out, and then you're going to have a difficult time with the Northern Alliance, which we subsequently did. Now, that was Al Qaeda that did that. But leadership is not necessarily the essence of your problem. Sometimes it is, look at Nasrallah, for example. I still maintain Israel would be better off, and Israel makes a practice of this. Israel is all about assassination again and again and again. Nasrallah would have been a better leader for Israel to deal with, indeed for Lebanon to deal with, throughout this problem we have right now, that it looks like it's going to wind up with Israel taking the whole state of Lebanon virtually, except maybe for our embassy, than the crew we've had since then. Maybe you've got the same thing going on with Hamas. You keep killing the leadership, you're going to get down to somebody who is as ruthless as you possibly can be and waves all manner of restrictions on their action. It's just a stupid philosophy to follow, that if you kill the leader, you're going to have a better situation. History demonstrates more than often you have a worse situation.
Yeah.
Larry, who's stronger when it comes to the policies in Ukraine, Starmer or Donald Trump?
Well, what do you mean stronger?
Because when you see the attack on Russia, the attack on the Russian president, on Putin's residence, which we know in the mainstream media, they said, no, that wasn't an attack on Russian president. It was an attack of something else. They tried to but from the Russian sources, they confirmed that was an attack on Russian president. Period.
Yeah. Well, in terms of, if you measure in terms of the country's attitudes, not just Starmer and Trump, clearly the Brits are more obsessed with dealing with Russia, or trying to contain Russia, or trying to destroy Putin. It's just an obsession with the Brits, has been the case, but good Lord, now more than 80 years.
How about 400 or 500?
Yeah. Well, at least going back to the war in Crimea. Okay,
Yeah.
So 170 years. It is the problem the Brits have is limited capability. They can be malevolent. They can kill some people, but they don't have the power to actually tip the war in a direction that will give Ukraine an out. I've been telling people in recent. I got asked yesterday, and I said, look, this is just a simple math problem, and the math problem is this: Ukraine. I was told by the former prime minister, who I spoke with 5 weeks ago, and he says Ukraine's population now is down to 19 million. Russia is 150 million. Let's just assume that both sides are suffering the equal amount of casualties, which they're not. The Ukraine is suffering the disproportionate amount. And right now, it was reported yesterday that the exchange of bodies, dead Russian soldiers for dead Ukrainian soldiers, is at a ratio of 60 to 1.
Wow.
And that Russia is sitting on a pile of Ukrainian bodies that the Ukrainians don't want back. But if you just assume that both sides are suffering the same amount of losses, let's say they're suffering 1 million men a year. Well, do the math. How long can Ukraine continue the fight? Well, they'll be lucky to go 8 years, because that 19 million includes women, children, and elderly. Russia's got 150 million. So just by virtue of that, there's no way that Ukraine will prevail ever. And yet, the Brits, the Germans, the French, and the United States continue to facilitate their suicide, providing them weapons, providing them money, providing them intelligence, and for what purpose? Because the West has become convinced they don't have good intelligence sources in Russia. They've been relying upon what they've been told by the Ukrainians. and they become convinced the Russian economy is fragile. It's heavily dependent on oil. All you got to do is just destroy their oil sector. They're going to collapse, and we'll be able to take over the country. They really believe this, and that's what's so absurd.
It's not just about the United Kingdom, Colonel. Here is in Germany. Look at this. The teenagers were asked. Let me just, yeah. Let me just bring the, yeah. The teenagers. Let me read it for you. The teenagers were asked if they're ready for war with Russia. And when they do these sort of surveys in Germany, and you see what the way that the government is behaving, are they preparing their people to fight Russia? Do they really want to continue this conflict? And what is the benefit for Germany? You've mentioned the attitude of the United Kingdom, which we know it's imperial attitude. You can follow on that line, but what is in what is in it for Germany?
The polls I'm seeing indicate that the majority of the German people are not for what policies Merz is pushing with regard to Ukraine or with regard to Russia. That's the polls I'm seeing. I don't know what the accurate figure is, but it's somewhere between 55 and 60% don't agree with it. There are different reasons listed for not agreeing with it, but all of the reasons can be interpreted to Germany does not want a war with Russia, at least the bulk of its people. I think you'd find the same thing in France. I think you'd find the same thing in that portion of the United Kingdom we call England. But it's not what their leaders feel because their leaders are tied to these policies. They're tied to these policies hook, line, and sinker. And it's the only thing they can push. And what they're trying to do is propagandize their people, if you want to use that term, I think it's accurate, in order to get enough of them on their side to carry out their policies. I don't think it's going to work. I think from what I'm seeing in the polls is you're going to see these, as I've said earlier, and will continue to say, these leaders gone in the sometime in this new year, because the election system is going to work, as awkward as it is in all three countries really now. It's going to work and kick them out of office. Then the question becomes, what is the policy of the subsequent leader? And that's difficult to determine right now because there are different situations in each one of those major countries. And in fact, there are different situations in each of the other countries too, like Norway and Finland. And we've seen the Netherlands speak, I think, at least to a certain extent. But it's not a constant feeling amongst the people in Europe that, one, they want to give up their luxurious social programs. Two, they want to give it up to defense spending. And three, they want to use that defense spending to start a war. So these leaders are not representing their people.
Larry, you've mentioned that the Russian response to what Ukrainians did, the attack on Russian president, would be harsh. But after all, don't you think that the Russian president, on one hand, is thinking of the way that Donald Trump is trying to solve the problem in Ukraine? How do you see the two? Because on one side, you have to respond to what has happened. On the other hand, you don't want to escalate that much to sabotage the ongoing negotiations between the West and Russians.
Well, I would reject your statement that Trump is trying to resolve the situation between Russia and Ukraine. He is not. There are a lot of things he could have done already that would have signaled an actual resolve to get the conflict settled, such as reestablishing complete normal diplomatic relations with Russia, which includes sending a top level ambassador to Moscow, someone that is known to have the full confidence and trust of Donald Trump, as well as returning the property that the United States seized during the last days of Barack Obama's presidency from the Russian diplomatic missions in the United States, to reestablishing the flights between the United States and Russia, direct flights, as well as lifting sanctions. Just say no, we're not going to keep going this route. We're going to stop. He's doing none of that. The only thing they have done is some of the Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctions that were imposed on RT, Russia Today. Those have been quietly lifted. And I discovered that when John Kiriaku's show Whistleblower came back online, and I was his first guest, I guess. And I said, "How are you doing this?" He says, they've lifted the restrictions, so he can do it now and get paid. Which under Biden they shut it down about a year and a half, 2 years ago. So there has been movement on that front. Uh, but beyond that, uh, Trump continues to entertain peace plans that are either crafted by Keith Kellogg, Captain Crunch, or the cornflakes guy, um, or Zelensky or the Europeans. None of those, whether we're talking the 28-point peace plan, the 19-point peace plan, the 20-point peace plan, none of those are acceptable to Russia at all. They are dead on arrival proposals. And Russia's terms have been made very, very clear. And while Trump has, in his last remarks surrounding when Zelensky was at Mar-a-Lago, he did, affirm the Russian position. Yeah, it's not going to be a ceasefire. But beyond that, we've not seen any concrete steps or moves by anybody in the West to come to grips with the Russian demands. And so at this point, uh, Russia's options are to win it on the battlefield. And I've been maintaining that all along. There's not a negotiated settlement here to be had. It is going to require the actual defeat of the Banderites, the Azov battalion, the right sector.
Colonel, here is what Zelensky said, his New Year message to maybe to Ukrainians.
What does Ukraine want? Peace. Yes. At any cost? No. We want the end of the war, not the end of Ukraine.
Ми хочемо закінчення війни, але не закінчення України.
Are we tired? Extremely. Does that mean we are ready to surrender? Those who think so are deeply mistaken.
Здатись сильно помиляється той, хто так думає.
Colonel, don't you think that the continuation of the conflict is the end of Ukraine, not putting an end to the conflict?
Yes, the end of Ukraine and perhaps the end of the peace in Europe. Back to what Larry said, I'm thinking about what he was saying when he was saying it. And I think the major impediment, and I may be wrong in terms of it being major, but I think it is an impediment to Trump being more forthcoming in the way that Larry suggested, is called Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, and some Democrats too, who won't give him maneuver room, and his own national security advisor / Secretary of State, who to this point has bitten his tongue and his upper lip and been a little bit conducive to Trump's policy, would turn on him too, aided by these people in the Senate. He wouldn't do it himself within the administration, but aided by the people in the Senate who would give him a lot of backup. So Trump doesn't have a lot of leeway to do the kinds of things that Larry suggested, although they're commonsensical and they're what he should do in order to put an end to this damn thing, like he said he was going to way long ago. He can't because of his lack of maneuver room in that respect. And there are problems right now in the MAGA movement. Everything from what Charlie Kirk's assassination did and the relationship with Israel to people who are questioning Epstein even more virulently now with regard to Trump and the people in the Republican Party who are involved, undoubtedly involved, just as the Democrats like Bill Clinton are. So he's got this problem, I think, psychologically, physically, whatever you want to call it. He's in a trick bag right now.
Larry, do you score anything for the Trump administration considering the two cases, Epstein case and the Charlie Kirk, assassination? So far with Kash Patel and his administration, we haven't seen any clue about what has happened during, with the case of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Is that going to help Donald Trump? Is that going to help his sort of movement, or maybe the candidate they have in their mind for 2028?
Trump's problem is he's being held hostage by Israel, or he has completely surrendered himself to Israel. So, with the case of Kash Patel as an example, Kash Patel is a whore, a prostitute. He has sold out to Israel, as has John Ratcliffe. The problem this creates for the Trump administration now, and it's particularly centered on the Charlie Kirk and Epstein, is in both instances, Israel is front and center. The pressure being brought to bear on people who are pointing to Israel's hand, and I personally believe that members of Israeli intelligence were involved with the murder of Charlie Kirk. I, I think the circumstantial evidence on that is overwhelming. The motive for it is quite clear. But, this is not the first time Israel's been involved with assassinating an American political figure. It goes back all the way back to John F. Kennedy. And again, the evidence on that part, people say, "Oh, you're just a conspiracy theory." Just look at the damn facts.
Yeah.
The ties between what Kennedy was doing in order to try to prevent Israel from getting a nuclear weapon, and the activities of Meyer Lansky, other prominent Zionists that were involved with the nuclear industry up in Pennsylvania, and then the ties in with the CIA. James Jesus Angleton, who was honored when he died, he was honored by the Israeli government. The only CIA officer I'm aware of that got that kind of recognition and honor. So what you've got going on here is the Israelis have just they continue to act with impunity, but it's creating a real pushback and a reaction. And Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly right now are sort of the front people for that, and it just shows you how crazy these Zionists are, that they were attacking Megyn Kelly as an anti-Semite. Now, if anybody knows anything about Megan's career, you could accuse her of being a water carrier for Israel. And she used up a couple of tubes of chapstick from kissing Israeli ass over the years.
Yeah.
But now even she's pushing back, that recognizing these extreme attacks by the likes of Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin, that Americans are getting sick and tired of it. And there's a retired special forces NCO. He does a podcast at Valhalla VFT, and he just said, "Hey, we are sick and tired of this Israel first, America second." And he's not a big Trump supporter at all. In fact, he's quite critical of Trump. But there is that is developing, and Israel has created a problem for itself, because right now, and this gets us maybe a little off topic or shifts us to where you want to go, where they have now unleashed a new propaganda campaign designed to lay the foundation so that there will be public support for renewed attacks on Iran. And it's all centered around, all of these protests that are sweeping Iran, and Trump is weighing in, "Yeah, we're going to attack Iran if they shoot any protesters." I mean, it's crazy stuff, but that this is this didn't crop up organically, because people go, "Oh yeah, we're really outraged at what Iran's doing." No, this is completely manufactured, and it has one purpose: to get the United States back involved militarily with Iran. And both the Israelis and the United States are making a damn stupid decision on that front.
And Nima, at the same time, they've re-energized and refinanced, probably Miriam behind a lot of it, their campaign inside America to make sure that their programs of dealing with anti-Semitism are rampant in every state of the union. They have it all going again, reinforced, everything from our school systems to our history books, you name it. They're writing the chapters. They're writing the Palestinians out and the state of Israel in. They're desperate in some respects.
Yeah.
And you look more and more at this and you see just how desperate they are because they understand viscerally they're losing the young people in America, even their own Jewish friends. They're losing them.
Yeah.
Carol, what's so amazing to me being in Iran after 12 years, more than 12 years, and seeing what's going on streets here in Tehran. I mean, I'm currently in Tehran, and I have many friends all around the country. I'm in contact with them to see what's going on there, and it's not even comparable to what's going on in the mainstream media. They're somehow exaggerating everything as though it's a revolution against the current regime in Iran. you know the only reason, I was talking with Larry the other day, the only reason for that, this disconnection between the reality in Iran and what is reported in the mainstream media, somehow in the alternative media, would be the only reason for that could be they want to prepare to attack Iran.
Yeah. It's not quite as glaring, but the same thing's going on with regard to Moscow and Russia in general. The Russophobia in this country is generated by the propaganda that is aimed at generating it. It's not a reality, as Larry has said, and others have said many, many times over again who know Russia. But it's happening, and it's happening in spades now with regard to the country you're sitting in. We will do everything and Israel's helping. Israel is helping with this too. Netanyahu's speech in English about, oh, we'll bring you water. We'll bring you the world's greatest water expertise and experience. All you got to do is let us in. And this is all part of the same warp and woof. We're going to war with Iran. And Trump's going to be right there with him. Miriam Adelson is so far up Trump's derriere with lots of money that we're going to go with him. I'm not even sure he's going to have to ask. I think he already asked at Mar-a-Lago, and Trump gave him the nod.
Yeah. Larry, here is what Donald Trump said. Larry, here is what Donald Trump said, about the attack on Iran. And the way that he's talking, I was talking with one of the officials here, it's trying to humiliate Iranians, by just look at the video and the way that he's talking about attacking Iran again.
And speaking of Iran, I hope they're not trying to build up again, because if they are, we're going to have no choice but very quickly to eradicate that buildup. So I hope Iran is not trying to build up, as I've been reading, that they're building up weapons and other things. And if they are, they're not using the sites that we obliterated, but they're using possibly different sites. We know exactly where they're going, what they're doing. And I hope they're not doing it because we don't want to waste the fuel on a B-2. It's a 37-hour trip both ways. I don't want to waste a lot of fuel.
Yeah, it's somehow how you can imagine every time it comes out, they if they want to negotiate, we're ready to negotiate, and coming out this way and talking this way is somehow unbelievable to me.
Well, Iran's production of ballistic missiles has been an issue for Israel, and to a lesser extent for the United States. The United States doesn't pay much attention to it until Israel starts screaming. But you know, Iran's ability to produce those missiles was not disrupted at all by the 12-day war.
Mhm.
And reportedly, Iran did not use its most sophisticated ballistic missiles. It used some of the older stuff. And initially, it was all the older stuff. And then as the 12 days progressed, they began using some of their more recent productions that had far more capability as far as being hypersonic and steerable. Uh, and that's what brought the Israelis to the point of begging Trump to intervene to stop the pain. Iran did so. In retrospect, I think foolishly so. Uh, I personally believe they should have continued until the Israeli government was forced to collapse and call for and to essentially surrender, to stop. Um, but the Israelis and their foolishness believe that they can do this again. What they did in 6 months ago, and that they will succeed this time. It's the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again, believing that you're going to get a different outcome. But I think if you would have asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said, "Nah, I don't think there's a chance that we're going to go back and attack Iran." No, I've completely changed my mind now based upon what we're seeing with this information operation that's being carried out, suggesting that there are widespread protests. All we need to do is intervene militarily. And look, I actually believe there are folks in the intelligence community, both on the Israeli side and on the U.S. side, that are saying, "Oh yeah, no, this is an organic movement. There's a widespread unrest. They're going to rise up. All we got to do is attack this point or that point, and it'll collapse." They're being told that, and instead of having enough critical thinking skills to push back, I think Trump and his officials are going to go along with it.
Colonel, did you notice that the government, the officials in Israel are attacking Tom Barak? Tom Barak is you know, he did everything to support Israel, to help Israel. But right now they're attacking Tom Barak because he said that we have to accept that the Muslim community is growing, and the United States cannot fight everybody on this planet who's Muslim in favor of Israel. And this is the reality on the ground, because the way that Israel is growing the tensions with Turkey, with Iran, with everybody, and then new alliance, new sort of partnership with, South Cyprus together with Greece. This is this is some sort of a dilemma on the part of the United States. To what extent do they want to support Israel? How far they can go in that direction?
Don't tell anybody this right now because it would be a secret let out. That's exactly what we want. That's exactly what the United States wants. Now, I'm not saying Donald Trump wants it. I don't know. And I'm not saying that anyone in his cabinet wants it. I don't know. But there is a group of people in this country, call them globalists, call them neoconservatives, call them Islamophobic assholes, pick your name, that wants every Muslim on the face of the earth exterminated, or close thereto as you can get. Now, you know that I've thought all along, and have never backed off of it, this is one place where I differ with Larry, that we were going to war with Iran again. It was inevitable because Netanyahu wants that as the last chapter, although there's never a last chapter for Bibi. He's always got a new book in the works. And it's going to be disaster for both countries. It's going to end Israel's existence as a Jewish state, certainly, and maybe even as a state, period. And it's going to hurt the empire so significantly that, along with the economic crisis that is coming now, I think in 26, probably curb every instinct we have for reaching out and striking everyone, with the possible exception of our own hemisphere, which worries me, because we will then concentrate our own hemisphere and do irreparable damage to it from one end to the other. You may have seen what the ambassador Trump appointed, that moron that he appointed, already knew what he was like from the Netherlands, where he had to apologize. I think that's where he was ambassador. Now he's in Canada, making himself persona non grata, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if Canada doesn't send him back to Washington because of the statements he made. He's a moron. He's a Tea Party guy, come up through the Freedom Caucus, the rest of the garbage that goes along with that. That's where we are right now, but we are going back to war with Iran. You know what I think about what I said earlier? You heard me say it. The Iranians should have finished it off. They should have finished Israel off. The president was not right in the way he dealt with this, and I think it was principally him. Now, he had to have a lot of help and a lot of persuasiveness in order to do this. But you're looking at a situation where Iran had, I think, the tiger by the tail, but the tiger was very, very injured, and they could have gone on and finished it. They didn't. Now they're going to have to do it again. And now they're going to have the prospect of Bibi going nuclear. They're going to have the prospect of the United States being so pressed by what happens afterwards that it manages to destroy itself in Iran or in Southwest Asia in general. This is disaster looming. It's disaster. But it's not going to be Iran being defeated in any way, fashion, or form. It's going to be Israel being defeated. And us, if we come in big and we come in on their side, maybe inviting Russia and even China into the fray. And we are looking at so many prospects across the globe right now for a really wider, bigger war that immediately morphs into a world war. And you put the economic crisis that's upon us, even as I speak, and going to manifest itself big time in 26. The empire is in deep, deep kimchi.
Larry, in the last 48 hours, here Iran received more than 4 cargo planes from Russia. And the officials here in Iran, they're saying that it doesn't matter what Donald Trump says anymore. We are prepared for war. We know that anytime that this attack could happen, and we are prepared to respond. But this time around, we're not going to stop. We're going to go to the end of it. This is the mindset right now within, as I talk with some of these officials. And how do you see the situation in Israel? Is all about Netanyahu, or you see all the country together? Do they really want all of them? They want this war to happen?
Well, Israel, like the United States, but on a far, uh, their situation is more severe, has limits. We don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited manpower. We don't have. We're both the United States and Israel, in terms of their financial balance sheets, are a nightmare. With deficit spending, the debt to GDP ratio in the United States is well over 125%. The debt in the United States continues to rack up, from climbing towards $38 trillion now. And so that translates into actually weakening military capability. Ultimately, the economics do affect it, but there is no strategy. That's the problem, because what is it that we're trying to accomplish? um, I could call. We're not trying to follow the the Coca-Cola advertising campaign. Remember when they had that ad? I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, and people swaying back and forth. Yeah, that would be a great goal if the United States said, "Hey, what we're committed to is putting an end to wars and promoting economic growth and development." That would be a great objective, and then we should have a strategy in place to achieve that. But we have to look at what we're doing. And what we are doing is fomenting war, encouraging conflict, and doing so in ways that we actually can't control. We have very, very limited control over the process. And Israel, they can talk all they want. They've got limits to what they could do. As I mentioned, the last time we talked, despite Israel's claim to have the greatest military in the Middle East, the most formidable professional military force, that group of losers, albeit murderers, have failed to defeat an insurgent group. I describe Hamas as an insurgent group after 26 months, when the Israelis had every single military advantage any military force could have. They had them surrounded. They'd cut off all resupply routes. The force that they're fighting is only armed with light weapons, rifles, some RPGs. The force they're fighting, the Hamas fighters don't have tanks, don't have artillery, don't have overhead intelligence, don't have fixed wing aircraft, don't have rotary wing aircraft, for God's sake, and are outnumbered by a factor of 10 to 1 at least. And yet Israel can't beat Hamas. They failed. Yeah, they're good at killing a bunch of innocent civilians, babies and toddlers and women and elderly. They can kill the hell out of them because they're not shooting back, they're not fighting. This is this disgrace that's gone on since October 7th by the Israelis shows that they are not only a bunch of cowards, but a bunch of incompetents.
You know, Nima, Bill Hartung from the Quincy Institute had an article in Tom Dispatch, which just got picked up by The Nation, I think, last night. I would recommend that to all your listeners. It essentially says what Larry just said, that we paint this one picture in the world of what we are, and then underneath that photo, we do everything the opposite, including being in Bill's situation. I think it's the other way around, but who cares what it is? Having Israel so prominently in our lexicon and our strategy and whatever exists of a policy, the world is turning against Israel in a massive sort of way. I'd say right now, 60% of the world would answer your question, what do you think of Israel? They make me sick to my stomach, with some kind of, epithet like that. That's not good. And it's not good for Trump, and not good for the Republican Party, and it's not good for the nation that we are being seen that way. And largely the reason we're being seen that way, no matter how you interpret the relationship, which way it runs, is Israel. And they're in our country building the propaganda machine again to capture the young people they're losing right now, this minute, financed by these people like Miriam Adelson. This is a disastrous situation. I don't think there's a situation in human history in 5,000 years that we know something about where another country has so infiltrated a major country, an empire, and brought that empire to its knees simply because of its adherence to that other country's policies or its use of that other country to carry out its own strategies, such as they are. It doesn't matter which way the relationship works, really. It is ruinous. And as I said, it's ruinous to us both.
Yeah.
Larry, I do believe that at least when I look at the Iranian side, if something happens, it's going to be a big war. It's not going to be the 12-day war between the two parties. Let's assume that happens and the United States gets involved in the war to help Israel, because after all, nobody would believe that a nation of, 8 million people can fight with a nation of 91 million people. It's not even comparable. That's why the United States would be part of the fight against Iran. So, how do you find the reactions? How do you find the way that Russia and China would see such a scenario?
Well, Russia and China then would be directly involved. That's one of the things that's changed since June 25th, when these hostilities were brought to an end, temporary end at that. Iran woke up from its delusional dream that somehow it could continue to operate in the world without having a military alliance with Russia and with China. And since then, Iran has recognized the error of its way, and it has been working and consulting closely with both Russia and China. And this arrival of Russian military aircraft, cargo aircraft, carrying, is it air defense systems? Is it other personnel that are going to help train up Iranian systems? The one thing we do know from the agreement, the treaty that was signed and ratified in January, February this year between Iran and Russia, is that there was going to be sharing of intelligence information. And I'm sure the Russians are monitoring that. Russia has put a top priority on protecting and enhancing, building up the north-south corridor, to which, and they've held at least 3-4 different consultations, not only with Iran but with Azerbaijan, because part of that is going to transit Azerbaijan. Uh, Similarly with the Chinese, they have been more active on the economic front in helping Iran than has Russia. So, and let's understand what the United States can do. Neither Israel nor the United States can conduct a ground invasion of Iran. That will not be it. The U.S. will be forced to rely upon bombing Iran with fixed wing aircraft primarily, whether they do standoff launches or actually come into Iranian airspace. The potential game changer is that if Russia and or China have supplied Iran with advanced air defense systems and with the personnel capable of operating them, then it's going to put the United States in a position that those planes, even the B-2s, could be vulnerable to being shot down. Um, it means that the bases that the U.S. has in Qatar, in particular, but in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they would now be targets. Uh, Previously, Iran did not actively target those and destroy those, and take out the naval base that's in Bahrain. Um, I think this next go round, if it goes to this, and the United States supports and is enabling a Israeli attack on Iran, we'll see those targeted, and then all of a sudden, the weakness, the limitations of U.S. power are once again going to be exposed, as they were exposed in March of this year in the Red Sea, as the United States failed to open the Red Sea and stop the Houthis from being able to blockade it.
And Lehman, let me just point out one thing about your litany of things that you started with Larry's question. You said 90 million in Iran, 8 million in Israel. I think it's more like about 6 million now, Jews.
Yeah.
And all the differential. There's one thing you forgot. Bibi has nuclear weapons, and he has them on submarines. And my information is that he's perfected the way of firing them from those submarines. Now, whether it's surface and fire a cruise missile with a nuclear warhead, or whether he's actually perfected some sort of SLBM, I don't know. But I know that I believe these people when they tell me he can fire one from a submarine. So this is an extremely dangerous situation because of what you pointed out. The correlation of forces is so against Israel. And ultimately, I think even against the United States, because of what Larry said, we're not going to invade. We're not going to put troops on the ground in Iran. It'd be disaster if we did. And the other thing I'm looking for is in the North Arabian Sea, a carrier to be taken out, completely taken out. I know that they can probably do that. I don't know if they would do that. That's the problem with it in terms of not a problem for the U.S. Thank God in that sense, but it's a problem for Iran. And what would that do? I mean, if you did that, what would it do? The Chinese are thinking about that right now because they can indisputably take 2 or 3 carriers out at the same time if they all have the stupidity to come into the South China Sea into the envelope of China's ability to kill them. Surface skimmers underneath the water in the submarine, and then also high velocity missiles. We're going to lose these carriers. They are legacy systems. $16 billion legacy systems, counting the air wings and all the rest of the thing. And they're going to go. And that's one of the epiphanies we're going to experience when we start something really bad. So this has got all the implications for a much wider war, especially when you tie it in with what's happening in Europe and everybody's desire to, they will want to spread it. They will not want to stop it. They'll want to spread it. When I say they, I mean the people that are going to benefit from it. And the people who just mind boggle me, who think that the best way to get out of this debt that Larry just enumerated is to start a global war.
Yeah.
Larry, here is what we've learned today, that the naval contingents from Russia, China, and Iran are converging in South Africa in anticipation of the start of exercise MOSI 3 in early January this year, 2026. And MOSI 3 is a BRICS initiative aimed at strengthening mutual cooperation in the defense sphere. It seems that BRICS also is heading the way that SCO is operating right now. Are these two, because SCO is somehow a security, sort of cooperation, but BRICS is not that. And do you
Yeah.
think that the BRICS is moving that way?
Yeah, no, I think there will be a natural convergence movement in that direction. Let's note that this naval exercise that they say is going to start sometime this month. The planning for this started more than a year ago, probably at least 18 months out. Um, you know, I spent 23 years doing uh, exercises, and the process of what's called an initial planning conference, where you create a scenario and then you decide who's going to play and what assets there will be, and then you create a scenario where you get what they call a MESL, a master sequence of events list, MSEL. Uh, all that takes some time to put together. So this is not something that's just been developed in the last 4 to 5 weeks. And the same applies to the recent naval exercises that China carried off the coast of Taiwan. So it is, um, I think the planning that's taking place within BRICS, and it's evolved from just seeing it as a strictly economic organization to one that may actually create an alternative to the United Nations. Because the problem right now with the United Nations is it's a colonial legacy system.
Yeah.
It's one that's dominated and controlled by these Lilliputians, France and the United Kingdom, along with the United States, where they can veto and and prevent action, as well as bully and threaten other countries to try to coerce them. There's just a growing number of countries who are getting sick and tired of that, and as a result, they're looking for alternatives. And one of the things that made the UN, gave the UN some teeth, was it did have the capability to deploy UN peacekeeping forces. So I don't think it's out of the question that we could eventually see BRICS peacekeeping forces available for deployment.
Yeah.
I would just add to that, Nima, that I think what they're looking at is the imperial rules-based order being more detrimental to their futures than any other single entity in the world. And so they're going to get rid of it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl and Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Well,
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, and keep us informed on what's going on over there in Iran.
Sure. I'm going to go to the southwest of the country because they say the protests in that region is more than what we have here in Tehran. But I'm going to keep you, informed about what's going on here. Yeah.
All right. Stay safe.
Yeah, be safe.
Thank you. Thank you. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
A few hours ago, the American newspaper The New York Times made a rather shocking statement. In particular, in its article, the New York Times acknowledged that even after Donald Trump came to power, the CIA continues to play a special role in coordinating Ukraine's strikes on Russian territory. Furthermore, as it turned out, while the head of the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth, was removing all pro-Ukrainian generals from office, CIA Director John Ratcliffe not only refused to touch his officers with pro-Ukrainian views, but even increased their support. Furthermore, reports indicate that John Ratcliffe not only managed to maintain the CIA's presence in Ukraine, but also achieved a significant increase in funding for his agency in this Eastern European country. All this allowed the CIA to develop an effective plan to carry out attacks on the most important components of Russian industry, using Ukrainian drones. Furthermore, as it turned out, all Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries and underground oil and gas storage facilities are coordinated solely with the help of CIA agents. At the same time, it is reported that John Ratcliffe personally reports to Donald Trump on the results of these attacks. According to him, oil refineries are Russia's Achilles heel, and regular attacks on these strategically important facilities can really cause serious damage to the Russian economy and the country's military-industrial complex. Moreover, as it turned out, the CIA also continues to provide significant support to Ukraine and Britain during their attacks on Russian-linked oil tankers not only in the Black Sea, but also in other parts of the world ocean. It is reported that Donald Trump praised the secret role of the United States in attacking Russia's energy industry, and personally ordered John Ratcliffe to strengthen the activities of the CIA in this direction. It is reliably known that 84 officers of the Central Intelligence Service are currently on the territory of Ukraine. It is well known that all these CIA officers are actively involved in the development and implementation of Ukraine's drone and missile strikes on Russia. Thus, all statements by Russian experts that it is Britain and the United States that supply Ukraine with the necessary intelligence to launch attacks on Russian territory are true. Thus, it becomes clear that Donald Trump, realizing that the Russian economy cannot be destroyed with the help of Western sanctions, fully supported the secret role of the United States in attacking not only Russian oil tankers, but also Russian energy facilities. Well, my dear truth seekers, let's hope that Vladimir Putin will not turn a blind eye to all this, and will make Trump pay a heavy price for his hypocrisy and duplicity. I believe that Russian intelligence should start a real hunt for all CIA and MI6 officers in Ukraine. If Moscow does not clear Ukraine of all foreign agents, drone and missile attacks on Russia will continue. Meanwhile, over the past 24 hours, the Russian army has achieved another success in the Special Military Operations Zone. In particular, war correspondents confirmed the significant victory of the Russian troops in the Kupiansk direction. As it turned out, on the last day of December, the Russian army took control of the settlement of Bogoslavka, south of Kupiansk. Thus, as you can see, the Russian units not only managed to stabilize the situation in Kupiansk itself, but also began advancing along the left bank of the Oskol River. It is reliably known that as of January 2nd, Russian troops control the northern, eastern, and central parts of the city. Thus, the blitzkrieg planned by the Ukrainian command in this strategically important city completely failed. At the same time, it is reported that as a result of the Kupiansk adventure, the positions of the Ukrainian troops in other sectors of the front were significantly weakened, due to the constant rotation and transfer of reserves. In addition, the Kupiansk adventure also deprived the Ukrainian army of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of pieces of heavy equipment. All this will undoubtedly harm the Ukrainian defense not only in the Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions, but also in the Donbass. It is also worth noting another massive Ukrainian drone attack on Russia. In particular, on the night of January 1st, Russian air defense systems shot down dozens of drones in the skies over Moscow, Tula, Voronezh, and Bryansk regions. Unfortunately, in the Kherson region, Ukrainian drones managed to hit a hotel and restaurant, where civilians were celebrating the new year. According to the governor of the Kherson region, Vladimir Seldo, 24 civilians were killed as a result of this terrorist attack. There is also one child among the dead. It is worth noting that Russia's response was not long in coming. In particular, the Russian aerospace forces, together with the missile units, launched a combined missile strike on the Odessa region. It is reliably known that during this attack, Russia used dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as 170 units of germanium kamikaze drones. As a result, on the night of January 1st, independent monitoring services recorded more than 100 powerful explosions in cities such as Odessa, Izmail, and Chernomorsk. Numerous explosions were recorded in almost all the seaports of these cities, through which Ukraine continues to receive military supplies from NATO countries. This Russian missile attack also provoked another blackout in the Odessa region, as a result of which the railway and enterprises of the military-industrial complex of Ukraine were de-energized. It is also worth noting the missile attack on the Odessa Wellness Center, in the southwestern part of the city. As it turned out, the French military secretly used the basement of this center as a warehouse for the Scalp cruise missiles. Additionally, this facility also served as a place of temporary deployment of mercenaries from NATO countries. Later, sources in the Russian military department confirmed that dozens of expensive NATO cruise missiles were destroyed as a result of this attack. In addition, the deaths of dozens of foreign mercenaries, along with Ukrainian and French servicemen, were also confirmed. Undoubtedly, the destruction of such a strategically important enemy facility was Russia's first great achievement in 2026.
Feel like the real thing that they're pissed at, one of the real things that they're pissed at Putin about in the West is that he won't take the bait. That they want him to throw a missile at Brussels or London or something so they can then say, Article 5, Trump, everybody look at what we do about it. And that Putin's like, the way to win this war is to win a war. We're going to knock the hell out of Ukraine. We're going to take Ukraine, and then you're going to be screwed. And then everybody's going to look at you and say, hey, you told us that, and they were going to let blah, blah. And that's my feelings. Let me throw it at you, Mark, because I know there's a lot of people in Russia. They want blood. They want it now. Anyway, your thoughts, Mark.
Yeah. So first, with regard to the provocations, David Ignatius warned us in the Washington Post, last year, earlier last year, that with the Kiev regime, shall we say, losing on the battlefield, that they were turning to what he called the dirty war, right? And that it was just starting. Well, the dirty war has actually been going on for some time, but I agree that in their desperation, they are turning to it more and more. And we can call it asymmetric warfare. We can call it unconventional warfare, dirty war, whatever you want to call it. But from the attacks on civilian shipping in the Black Sea, in the Med, the Atlantic, right? Everyone who trades with Russia, with a drone attempt to assassinate Putin, the attacks on the oil refineries, car bombings of generals, that sort of thing. That is going to be, I think, the big story going into this year as the war progresses, because as Russia continues on the battlefield with success after success, the Kiev regime will have to demonstrate victory, both of a sort, both for the regime, its troops' own morale, but also to continue the flow of weapons from the West, and that's just going to be a necessity. It's what they can do, and it's what they will do. And I also agree with you that Russia is not responding to these provocations, at least not on a quid pro quo escalatory basis. And I think you're right that it is part of the calculus of the Kiev regime, of the European political elite, of a considerable portion of the US government in all its various forms, the deep state, everyone except for a small cadre within the Trump administration around Trump. And even then, that's frankly questionable. We learned in the New York Times this week, just in the last 24 hours, a story came out that fessing up that the U.S. has been behind all of these oil refinery attacks in Russia, that they were providing the direction, the satellite guidance, everything. This was their, essentially, let's call it what it is, because ultimately, if the U.S. is doing this, then Trump is responsible for it, right? We have to acknowledge that. Either that, or we just admit that he's an incompetent, powerless president, completely not able to control his own security apparatus, and in which case it doesn't make any difference as far as Russia's concerned, right?
If I may throw in a quick comment on that. Well, we do know one thing we know, and that is historically the CIA is very rogue. So what the CIA does is not necessarily elements of the CIA, in that if the president goes too far from them, even he can become a point of attack. So the other thing I will say is this: I don't think that when these things happen, it's guaranteed that Trump was in on it, or even if the New York Times says Trump was in it, we still don't know. Though, you know what I mean? Anyway, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to wonder what the hell is Tulsi Gabbard doing as director of national intelligence if the CIA is completely rogue like that. But
which I think
whether this is a conscious game of Trump's to present himself as a mediator, trying to bring peace. Oh, the deaths, it's so sad. We have to end this senseless war, while trying to stick the Russians into accepting an end to the conflict on American terms that would preserve a Banderite fascist proxy regime in Kiev. Whether we believe that, or whether we believe that this is the CIA doing their own thing and Trump really can't control them, for the Russians, it doesn't make any difference, right? If you want to believe in Trump and that he's an incompetent, powerless do-gooder, at least in this particular instance, I mean, go for it. It's not impossible, right? I'm saying for the Russians, it doesn't make a difference because they have to deal with what the U.S. does, not what Trump says.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Ultimately, it's and that's very Russian, which is very, very practical, bureaucratic, which is to say, ultimately, you know, it is, I always talk about, what is it, Socrates versus Plato, or Socrates versus whoever it is, Aristotle. Is reality what we think and believe and consider, and narratives, or is reality what I can see and touch and feel? And the Russians have to deal with a reality that no matter what the narrative, no matter what you think or guess, if I got a bomb blowing up, and ultimately, what is the ultimate priority of the Russians? The ultimate priority is this: these people are trying to come to our border and threaten us physically. And now that they've lost, they want to preserve this thing that they use to, you know what I mean? Ultimately, it comes down to this: they've lost, and they know they lost. So now, how do we preserve the Banderite regime? How do we preserve a military element, an intelligent element that we can continue to use to attack with the Russians with? And the Russians' position has to be, we can't let you do that. And I think that's, now that they've lost the war, that's where we are at that point. How do we preserve this thing that we use against the Russians? And the Russians saying, we ain't gonna let you preserve it. And that's where we ultimately we're gonna come to at some point.
Yeah, that's where it is. In fact, I would say, to a certain extent, on a diplomatic level, they're even playing to the narrative Trump, largely still, right? I mean, but they're not letting that diplomatic game influence what they're doing on the battlefield in Ukraine at all, right? They're two separate tracks. So maybe that's Russia recognizing the, divergence, if you want to say that there is one, in the U.S. government, and dealing with it that way. But regardless, I mean, that is, if an attack on Putin, right, is only, ushering in the new year, well, then what is to come, right? Chemical weapons, false flags, all of these things are entirely possible. And ultimately, yes, part of the calculation is to bring the U.S. directly into the conflict, perhaps with a provocation that Russia responds to, perhaps with a false flag, but to give the Trump administration, which does seem to some degree to at least to want to distance itself from this conflict, and the Europeans and the Kiev regime, want to do the opposite. And that's what we're going to see. Russia's response, I think you're right again, is they want to stay inside an escalatory box that operates under the current rules of this proxy war, very similar to previous proxy wars between Russia or the Soviet Union and the US, that operates under certain rules. And they're winning comfortably, right, at their own pace inside that box. And as long as they stay in that box, then there's not the risk of them being outside that space where they're not winning handily. For instance, if they responded to this attack by killing Zelensky or firing an Oreshnik at one of the military bases in Germany where equipment is staged by the West for the Kiev regime, that would put them outside that box. That would be an escalation that would far more than likely bring the West directly into this conflict, and that would change it. And while I sincerely believe that Russia has the capability to win a conventional conflict against NATO in Ukraine at the current moment, Russia doesn't want to risk that. And Russia seems to be far more cautious and cognizant of the fact that even if they were winning that, there's that slippery slope down to nuclear escalation that they, being the only adults in the room in this situation, are at great pains to avoid anything that could lead down that path to that slope. So, how is Russia going to respond to an assassination attempt on Putin? Now, first of all, I have to say that I do not believe for a second that the West was not involved in this. The Kiev regime is not capable of carrying out that type of attack without the satellite intelligence and guidance that would be necessary at a distance to hit the Russian presidential state residence in Novgorod. On top of this, that state residence in Novgorod has an underground facility that is a nuclear war command center, right, from which the Russian president could give orders, equivalent to, let's say, the U.S. president on Air Force One, or facilities in Virginia that he might be taken to. So that, in effect, is also targeting an essential command and control part of Russia's nuclear triad. Again, right? So that is a huge escalation again in that respect. And particularly if the West was involved. Now, it could have been the United Kingdom. That is a possibility. The UK has been very fervent, trying to be the tail that wags the dog and incite further escalation all through this conflict. If you'll remember, the first Western country to send tanks to the Kiev regime was the UK sending the Challengers. Not that they did the Kiev regime any good whatsoever, right? But they were the one pushing the envelope. They were the first ones to send cruise missiles, right, to the Kiev regime, the Storm Shadows. They have been very openly directing the conflict in the Black Sea. This Admiral Radakin, taking, like, yes, we've beaten the Russians in the Black Sea kind of stance openly in the Western press. So it could be they would have the satellite capability necessary to do that. But I find it also entirely possible that the U.S. was involved in this. The timing is extremely suspicious. Now, Putin is spending most of his time at his apartment in the Kremlin, but they seem to have gotten the intelligence that he was in Novgorod, right, at that time for the presidential the presidential state residence there. Perhaps for the holidays. I don't know. Now, this is all. This attack occurred while Trump was meeting with Zelensky in the White House. But before that and after that, Trump called Putin. He called Putin and talked for an hour before Trump talked to Zelensky, and then he was like, well, okay, so I'll call you back in 2 or 3 hours when I'm done talking to Zelensky. It is entirely possible that the Americans, through that phone call, were able to positively determine where the Russian president was. They could presume that he would probably stay in the same place, right, for the next few hours, while Trump would ostensibly be talking to Zelensky. And that's when the attack happened. So there's a lot of Russian analysts, the Russian Telegram channels that are operating under the assumption that this was yet another type of diplomatic ruse, much like Trump was involved with Iran, facilitating the Israeli attack as a surprise attack beforehand. So there's a pattern here. If so, that is a very dangerous escalation. Even if the U.S. was not involved in this attack, I cannot seriously believe for 1 second that they didn't know about it. Because the New York Times has told us repeatedly that the U.S. is in absolute control of Ukrainian intelligence, and it's the SBU and the GUR, the Ukrainians' intelligence and military intelligence, that are responsible for formulating these type of long-range strikes, right? That's who does it. We're told this, quite proudly, that the CIA came into Ukraine immediately after 2014, took over the Kiev regime's intelligence and military intelligence, rebuilt them from the ground up in their own image, then built a whole series of CIA bases from which to run covert ops into Russia, right on the Russian-Ukrainian border. And that an entire floor of the SBU, the Kiev regime's main intelligence building, was preserved for the United States, and another floor for the UK, by the way. So I do not believe for a second that the Kiev regime launched 91 long-range strike drones without intelligence, satellite data from some Western country, and without the US, at least the CIA. And again, we can pretend that Trump is some kind of cipher in the White House who has no ability to control or do anything if you want. It doesn't make a difference to the Russians because they have to deal with what the US government is doing. So ultimately, the US either knew about this, they facilitated it, or they directed it. Take your choice. Whatever Trump may claim about, oh, outrage and how shocked he is, and boy, it's sure lucky I didn't give them tomahawks, huh? I mean, not that the tomahawks would have done any better than the drones, but that puts us, Russia, in a very tough position. Now, I believe that they are not going to hit Zelensky. They're not even going to hit the Ukrainian government, at least, not a body like the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, or specific ministers. And they're certainly not going to strike in Europe at anyone or the United States. They're going to stay inside that escalatory box. And from their perspective, they have to say, why would they risk going outside of that? Yeah, they launched 91 drones, and we brought them all down well before they could have even reached the Russian president's state residence in Novgorod. So they may not feel a need to. They may feel a political need to respond in a forceful way. We don't know exactly how they're going to respond yet. I've heard some chatter about an absolutely enormous drone and missile attack being prepared that would be the largest one thus far. But then again, we've seen several of those in the past couple of months where Russia keeps adding more and more drones as they have more and more they're approaching 1,000 Garan long-range strike drones a day being made and available for use. There is the possibility that now, with confirmation that the Oreshnik, Russia's new hypersonic ballistic missile that was used last year once against the military-industrial complex in Ukraine, right? The one that Russia is saying is basically a conventional weapon of mass destruction, at least when used in clusters. They could use that, and that would definitely make a statement about the seriousness with which they treat this. But what would they target? They could target the Kiev regime's intelligence, wherever they are currently hiding themselves, right? I'm sure Russia knows. They could do that. And they will almost certainly hit drone facilities, right? Facilities that make drones and facilities that operate them, maybe even the ones that actually operated this attack. Now, Russia's hit them many times before, and they'll hit them again, right? You destroy one and they pop up another one, right? That's this game of whack-a-mole, at least. But I agree with you. I don't think that Russia is going to escalate outside of that box, right? It could be also be more hits on energy infrastructure. They could they have the capability now. They're within one large salvo of completely blacking Ukraine out for more than a temporary basis. They could do that.
Blackout Kiev. Yeah, blackout Kiev for months. And this time in January, that's going to be a problem.
They're blacking out Kiev regularly now, but on a temporary basis, where it's blacked out for a few hours and then they're able to institute enough repairs. But Russia they are within the damage threshold that they could deliver a blow, not just to Kiev, but to the Kiev regime's electrical infrastructure as a whole, where most of the country could be plunged into permanent darkness and cold in the middle of winter, right? Because water, heating are still largely, a province of the electrical infrastructure and the electrical energy. So that is another possibility that they could do that as well. I tend to believe that they're not going to choose to respond to this attack that way because the electrical infrastructure is dual use, yes, but that could be seen then as responding against the civilian population to punish what the Zelensky regime did by trying to assassinate Putin. But they may rationalize things differently. They may do things differently. I don't know. But we are going to see a response. It's going to be a big response. We've heard that, yes, it will be non-diplomatic. The targets have already been selected. And I would presume that it will be certainly within a week, right? They're not going to wait any longer than that. Obviously, it was unlikely they were going to launch it on New Year's Eve. That would be a little crass, maybe, but we will see a response. And, then we can debate whether it was strong enough to deter further such incidences or not. I don't believe so. I don't believe there's anything they could do that will deter such dirty war attacks in the future. But
yeah, well, a couple of things and I took a little note. No, one of the reasons is this: terrorism is the tactics of the weak. So the West, the NATO demonstrates its weakness. It's like how we can't do anything on the battlefield. So the only thing we'll do is, wait till you turn your head and smack you in the back of the head and then say we didn't do it or something like that, right? So you're right. It doesn't deter it because the reason it's happening is because specifically they're losing. I would say this. I think one of the things that Russia understands is this very well. Their strength is that they control the escalatory ladder. They control escalations. Absolutely. If they then throw a missile at Berlin or wherever the hell outside, right? Then they have to wait and see what the other side does. So they don't control as long as everything that happens, they punch in Ukraine. No matter what you do, I'm going to keep punching Ukraine. Well, we'll do this, then I'm going to punch Ukraine again. I think they've determined at some point, whatever they do to us, we're going to take it out on Ukraine. For this reason, because that's where our victory is. Because that's what the pain of the West, the thing that really determines the future, the future for Russia, the future for NATO is Ukraine. You win, it's kind of like you watch a boxing match and some guy opens a cut, right? And he just keeps hitting that cut. He may be able, and a guy may like open another area, please hit me here, whatever. I'm going to keep hitting that cut because that's going to bleed so much. That's where the referee's going to stop it. And they understand they're going. And I think that's what the Russians, no matter what they do, the provocation, they're going after Ukraine. That is where the victory is. And I'll say this, even in this world right now, the true and some of the neocons understand it. The true pain for NATO, the true pain for the EU, that there's all of these people around the world in the global south, all looking at Ukraine, just waiting. And at some point, when it's clear that the Russians have won, the whole empire and colonial powers at that point are delegitimized in a way that a lot of them know, but a lot of people, you know what I mean? The in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, everywhere. What happens with this whole Taiwan argument and this, oh, we're going to do this, and all of these other suckers that they're trying to gear up, saying, let's get you full of weapons so you can stand up against China or whoever the hell. These countries then look over at the fate of Ukraine and say, uh-oh, we got to start asking some questions. So I think the Russians understand, the Russian leadership understand in a way that a lot of people that don't understand, that the entire world will not be the same when the colonial powers are defeated in Ukraine. It changes. It's the time that like 100 years, 500 years from now, people will look back and say, the day the Americans, the day they lost in Ukraine, the world took a right turn or a left turn or whatever it is.
Yeah, at the beginning of every one of my weekly weekend reviews, I punch home that ultimately this conflict is very likely to be a world order changing conflict in the end game of it, right? We're already there. And we've seen the US, the Europeans, they acknowledge this, right? We've heard multiple times, you know, that from Mark Milley, the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and others, right, that they believe that U.S. leadership is on the line. U.S. leadership, quote unquote, right? And they've said very similar things, right?
Let's call Bojo that said it. Bojo said it. Remember?
Bojo. Yeah, Bojo said he actually said the words that Western hegemony, that U.S. hegemony is on the line. He said those words, and we can translate U.S. global leadership, meaning U.S.-led Western global hegemony, because ultimately, to not 100%, right? Power. There are hard facets of power that matter to it as well, but there is also a narrative element, an element of belief, right? You have to believe and fear the hegemon. And if someone shows successful resistance in such a big way, then that fear, that belief in the power and control of the hegemon is gone. And we've seen this from actually going back since the beginning of this conflict. When we see protesters in Africa, in the Sahel and other states, flying the Russian flag, are they doing it because they support the SMO in Ukraine? No, not per se. They are using it as a symbol of resistance against the West. They are attaching their neo-colonial resistance against France and other Western colonial powers in Africa. And they see Russia effectively resisting that West. And therefore, it becomes a symbol to them of defiance. And smart people, right? And there are smart people within the CIA, within the deep state, within the bowels of Langley and everything. They understand how dangerous this is to them. And they cannot allow Russia to be seen as winning, right? Whether Russia wins and they have to somehow successfully spin it, i.e. positioning the U.S. as some kind of third-party arbiter and taking a step back, or whether, of course, their preference would be simply that Russia does not win, at least what everyone would recognize as winning. That it's going to be a body blow to U.S. hegemony. It's not going to bring the whole thing down, but it is seriously going to damage that rotten edifice in a way that is going to facilitate the eventual collapse of it. And we've seen Russia actually now in the last 2 decades in 3 conflicts inflict blows on that. The first one was the proxy war in Georgia in 2008 with the US-backed strongman that seized power in the country, Mikhail Saakashvili. A small war, just a few days, right? But just like with Ukraine, Georgia then at that time was a clear US proxy, although they've obviously emerged from that dark shadow now. The second one was in Syria, which was a much more in your face because the US was obviously moving towards direct regime change against Assad under Obama until Russia stepped in and dropped their troops in Syria and said, hey, we're here, right? And we're protected. Now, ultimately, Russia won on the ground, but then lost the peace as US sanctions hauled out the Syrian economy, the Syrian government, and allowed the whole military to be co-opted and just basically fade away within a few weeks. But
I think
Russia,
the jury's still out on that because there's a resistance forming. Russia's still there. The jury, talk to me in a few years and see. I think the jury's out on Syria.
I'll drink to that. I'll drink to that.
Well, in that case, right now, here's something that everybody can celebrate. It's Boosty.to. Mark Sloboda. We're up to 277 subscribers, and we
that was awful. That was an awful segue, Garland. Yeah. That was an awful segue.
Well, it's the best I can do. It's the best we can do on short notice. But it ain't much, but it's all we got for a segue right now. Mark, tell everybody it's boosty.to/the real politique. Mark Sloboda. Tell people what this is and how they join, why they should join, all that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm a Russian living in Russia, which means I'm under Western sanctions, which means that credit cards, the standard Patreon, YouTube, Buy Me a Coffee, Substack, none of them work for me, right? So, but Boosty is sanctions proof, right? Boosty is essentially a Patreon clone, right? That is sanctions proof. So that's why I've set up shop there. If you want to support me, if you want lots of exclusive content that I put out hours worth every week just for the subscribers there, please do so. So that's where you can follow all of my work. I'll put this video there. That's available for everyone. I've also got exclusive content I do, but that's where I've set up shop. So if you want more of my cynicism and fatalism and realism, that's the place to do it.
All right, everybody, Mark Sloboda. And you'll find, if you look there, all of his various, if you want to see what he's doing, all of his, like, for instance, Crosstalk, RT, all of his various appearances, and you can interact with Mark. So it's a great place to go. It's boosty.to/the real politique with Mark Sloboda. All right, Mark. One of the things that I think we always do when we talk, and that is this: we recognize this, that we're in a reality where the things that you can touch and feel are very important. The narrative is great, and we enjoy talking about it. But ultimately, what is driving this madness, on this desperation, and this terrorism? What's happening on the battlefield? I understand things ain't going so well, and a lot of towns falling. I mean, a lot of towns falling, it seems to me.
Yeah, so I would say that, the two most important recent ones that fell are Gulai Polya, which is in the eastern Zaporozhye region, and that one was somewhat quite unexpected. We've also seen Stepnogorsk in the western Zaporozhye region fall. Russia's just racing through Zaporozhye, right? They are already within 15 kilometers, count them, 15 kilometers of Zaporozhye city itself, right? That's how close they are. What part of what people are saying is that Zaporozhye city, right? When you talk in agglomeration, right? That means urban areas that more or less roll into each other, like Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, right? Were technically separate settlements, small city settlements, but in operational terms, they were more or less part of one big urban agglomeration. It's the same thing with a number of small towns that basically roll into Zaporozhye, and Russia is already on the outskirts of that outer town that you could consider part of the urban agglomeration. So the battle for Zaporozhye city could, by some standards, already be considered to be starting now, right? So that's very significant there, because that Zaporozhye is a major industrial center for the Kiev regime, and if Russia takes that, that will basically collapse everything west or everything east of the Dnieper River and south of Kharkov. That would collapse. It would also give Russia the type of solid crossing of the Dnieper River that it could then move on Nikolaev and Odessa, right? They could cross there and then move south to Nikolaev and Odessa. So it would be, I expect to see Russia moving on Zaporozhye in a big way by the tail end of next year, right? They'll be moving on Zaporozhye in a big way. The other perhaps big thing is Russian forces in the Donbas region. The advancements they're making in Konstantinovka and Liman, but also there in the southern Kharkov region, there is a big fog of war about what is actually happening in Kupiansk, which Russia took at the end of November, but then the Kiev regime launched a let's strip every other front and throw in the kitchen sink counter offensive in that area, and pressed Russia hard in December. And we don't know how. We don't know. I don't myself know what percentage of Kupiansk city Russia holds and what's part the Kiev regime holds of this part. I honestly can't tell you. I hear contradictory things, and all of the evidence is not conclusive. But I can tell you that it seems that the Kiev regime's counteroffensive has run out of steam. So Russia seems to be now pushing back, however back they were pressed from it. And effectively what we're seeing now is a sixth battle for Kupiansk in this war, which is just crazy, but that's actually what we're on there. Taking Kupiansk is going to be necessary. The next domino after Kupiansk is Izium, and that is the northern gateway to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which is the last of that Kiev regime's last defense, the top of that Kiev regime's last defensive line in the Donbas region, which Russia will be moving on by the summer. Again, by some standards, if you want to talk a wider agglomerated area, Russia is already moving on Slavyansk now from Seversk, which they took a few weeks ago, a very important stronghold there. So it's all coming to a head. The Donbass will be settled this year, probably definitely by the autumn. But that is that southern Kharkov region taking Kupiansk is what's going to facilitate closing the supply lines from the north to that last defensive line in the Donbass.
Now, let me ask you this. If we look at Zaporozhye, right, the other part of it, taking Zaporozhye or somewhere, does the Kiev regime, do they use the river to move goods up to the Dnipro and up to Kiev? I mean, because at that point, if they take Zaporozhye, they own the river, they close the river off. Is that a important artery for the Kiev regime for their country?
No, it's not. You have to remember, first of all, the Kakhovka Reservoir Dam was blown up a couple of years ago in this conflict,
right?
Which caused a lot of problems there. So that is not a major artery. The actual artery, of where things are brought in is Odessa, right?
Okay. Yeah, I guess.
That's where the Kiev regime gets goods out and gets armaments in, is through Odessa. But again, if Russia takes Zaporozhye, that will allow them to cross the Dnieper and move on Nikolaev and then Odessa from that point. So that's why it would be important. But that would be no sooner than 2027 if the conflict lasts that long.
It also seems that they've really stepped up their strikes on Odessa now. That Odessa for a while was off. And so now they are, okay, a lot of stuff may come in at Odessa, but they're hitting ships and ports with stuff. And they're hitting ports, they're hitting trains. So now, rather than Odessa being kind of an unmolested hub for the activity, for supplies, life's getting harder and harder. And they're even cutting down the power. And so even though they haven't taken Odessa, it's getting very difficult to utilize that as a hub for commercial activity and military activity, isn't it?
Absolutely. So this is a response. This is a direct response to the Kiev regime, and because the West helps them with everything, the attacks on civilian shipping. Right, the oil tankers and other. There was even a sunflower oil tanker hit, for whatever reason, simply because it's Russian. This was Russia's response to that, right? Because ultimately, all of those surface drone attacks, everything that happens in the Black Sea, is directed out of Odessa. And Putin warned, if you attack our civilian shipping again, then we are going to shut Odessa down. And that's what they're doing. Right? They attacked more civilian shipping, and Russia is shutting Odessa down. They're attacking the Western ships bringing arms in port. They're attacking the ports. They're attacking the warehouses. They're attacking the electrical infrastructure, without which, the port becomes useless. Right? You can't get things that are in and out of it. They're not only hitting Odessa, but they're hitting the two smaller ports also in the Odessa region there, Izmail and Chornomorsk, right? Those are being hit as well. They're even hitting the bridges that go from, for instance, Romania through Moldova into Odessa. And that is the route by which 60% of all fuel that the Kiev regime uses comes into the country. There's a couple of bridges there. The Mayaki Bridge is one of them, and Russia's just hitting that again and again and again. Now, here's the thing: we've seen this repeatedly in this conflict, is that bridges, particularly bridges built by the Soviet Union, are really hard to bring down. Right? They're solid apocalypse-proof things. But Russia now has the drone capability, right? They're producing so many Garan drones a day and so many missiles, right? The production rate is going up, that they can now afford to hit something on an almost nightly basis if that's what they need to stop the use of that. So that's why they're hitting the bridges. They're even hitting the train infrastructure in the Odessa region. And they're not only cutting off Odessa, basically shutting Odessa down, but they've started doing the same thing against the Kiev regime's train infrastructure in Kiev, that through which supplies are brought in from Poland, right? They've been hitting that whole train route there again. In a way, you know, I've heard a lot of times people ask me, why hasn't Russia gone after supplies from the West coming into the Kiev regime? Why haven't they gone after the roads and the trains? And the short story is that Russia really lacked the capability, at least to do it in a cost-effective way. Because when you're talking about things like trains and bridges, the truth is they can be rebuilt. And you know, particularly with the trains and train tracks and stations, they can be repaired pretty quickly. The Kiev regime is good at that, just like Russia is, because they are still the remnants of the Soviet Union, you know, in that regard. It is only now that Russia is producing so many long-range strike drones and so many missiles that they can now afford to hit these things regularly, even if they could be repaired. And it has to be said that the Kiev regime is rapidly losing the ability to repair their electrical and transport infrastructure because it's been deteriorated so much, and their own ability to repair it has been deteriorated as well, both material wise and financially. It's a new. A lot of people despair, for whatever reason, of the pace of the contact lines movement with the war of attrition. Even though intellectually they may understand that Russia's winning a war of attrition, they've become used to, I don't know, Call of Duty, you know, Hollywood, and they want big maneuver warfare, Russia winning the war in 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. You know, that just was never in the cards. And Russia is moving faster with the war of attrition. That is undeniable, but it's still not fast enough for some people. But if you want to see an escalation that is really happening, that is taking things to another level, that is Russia's long-range strike war of attrition right now. The way it's pounding Odessa, the way it's pounding Kiev, it is simply reaching levels that, you know, have never been seen before, you know, quite obviously with the numbers, the damage being done, and the damage to the electrical infrastructure, the train infrastructure, the port infrastructure. This is going to have long-term effects, sapping the strength of the Kiev regime, their ability to recover from losses on the battlefield and so forth. It's serious, and it's happening now in a big and very noticeable way.
One last thing, we only got a few more minutes, but I did want you to comment on this. There's another that I see, and what was, you know, a full spectrum. This is a full spectrum war against Russia. So there's one other spectrum that we need to talk about that I think is in Russia's is a strength that Russia is playing, and that is EU is experiencing both political and economic instability and deterioration. One being they're looking at, we got to figure a way to come up with more money to give the Kiev regime, and that ain't easy. So we got to try to sell some bonds. Who the hell's going to buy these bonds? The people are going to go bananas. So they've got that political instability, and they're looking at it as we talk about the long term. Well, what's going to happen in the summer and the fall? How the heck are they going to come up with money by May or June when they're out of money? And last but not least, Jacques Beau. I think that was a mistake. People all over are like, whoa, you know, that's all over the internet. That's all over everything. That's who these people are. They're fascists, but political, economic instability in the EU, which I think, again, is to Russia's advantage. It is a full spectrum. But Russia, it's something that Russia doesn't have to do. These clowns are doing it to themselves. They can wait that out. Anyway, your thoughts on those two issues, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're living in two different realities, right? If you check on the pages of The Economist or these other, is Russia's economy about to collapse? And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Right?
I was just in Moscow. It was fantastic. Let me say, we went to fine restaurants, Mark, and I stuffed myself full of the most delicious Georgian food. And it didn't. Did you see any of those articles about the Russians eating each other?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I didn't think they were eating each other.
Yeah, on the battlefield, they're eating it. So it's just the propaganda is getting absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, when we talk about me and Garland feasting, neither of us are extremely wealthy individuals. At any of that, right? This is standard fare available to all Russians. But anyway, yeah, it's not Russia's economy that's in jeopardy and at risk of collapse. It's the European economies, right? Whether we're talking the UK and France, whose own ministers, right? Not me, not my propaganda, if you don't want to trust me, but the British and French finance ministers have both talked about they may need to take out bailout loans from the IMF because they're on the point of bankruptcy, right? Germany's, just type in Germany and deindustrialization. The words are practically, a collocation at this point, how often they've been put together, even in the Western press. So they attempted to, steal by way of this financial chicanery, the sleight of hand, Russia's frozen assets in Euroclear with this reparations loan. And there was enough dissension within the EU from, it has to be said, the European Central Bank, from the IMF, that put an end to that. And Euroclear itself, of course. So what they came up instead was really just a stopgap. Well, 140 billion from that would only have kept the Kiev regime alive for another year. Now, what they've settled on instead is a $90 billion loan that the collateral is actually the European common budget. And they're supposed to allow bonds to be taken out on this. Who is actually going to buy these bonds? I really don't know, because there's no solid collateral for them. And the Europeans are saying that the money they give to Ukraine will never be paid back until Russia pays war reparations. And everyone with a brain can see that Russia's winning this war and is never going to pay war reparations. They may demand reparations from the Kiev regime at the end of this. They may demand reparations from the Europeans at the end of this, right? But they're not going to be paying anyone any reparations. So I can only imagine what the interest rate would be. And actually, whether we were talking the 140 billion or the much smaller 90 billion, which it will be lucky if it lasts the Kiev regime a year, they weren't going to get either of those full sums, right? Because part of those already had to go to pay off previous loans that have been given to the Kiev regime, right? On this.
Using a credit look, that's like using one credit card to pay off the other credit card.
That's exactly what it is. It's not just like it. It is exactly what it is, right? And the interest that they're already paying on previous loans that they've given to the Kiev regime is starting to become a really significant financial burden on them. And now with this 90 billion, they're not going to be able to pay off that. They're just going to try and pay down, pay off the interest that is owed. And they're just, they are literally sacrificing their own children's and grandchildren's future for a conflict that they're going to lose anyway in Ukraine. If I don't care about Europeans, I'm sorry, we're in a war. I don't. But if you are a person who cared about Europeans, well, then you could weep for them. You could weep for their future, because This is what their political elite is doing to them. They're literally putting their children and their grandchildren's futures at risk. You know,
I don't think it's risky. I don't think this is risky anymore. I think they've thrown them in the toilet and flushed. Oh, well, Mark Sabota, before we go, let's remind everybody because I know everybody's like, wow, this is great. I really enjoyed this show. How can I find out more about Mark Sabota? There is a way, isn't there, Mark?
There is, and that's at The Real Politics.
Cuffing. Follow me.